great news that it's exciting. President Biden has announced that by July 4th, 3 people can get together, so as long as they're related in the same family, if they've all been vaccinated, and they can take their mask off for a second. 3 people after July 4th, if you're related and you've been vaccinated. I mean, how out of touch is that? I mean, does he go out? Does he know any real people? Is anybody paying attention to anything he is saying? Does he really think that he's sort of instilling confidence in us by going on a Zoom call and putting a mask on? Has Dr. Fauci told him that he can catch it through the webcam somehow? I mean, this is insane. But these are the people leading our country and telling us, what we can and cannot do. The governor's not a lot better. In fact, I would say the governor's worse than most of the Democrat governors around the country as far as his restrictions. And I think the burden should be on these people. If they're going to take your freedoms from you, the burden on them is to prove that there's some kind of science. I still might oppose it even if the science were there, but they need to have a burden to prove to us that what they're doing and telling us actually has some science that supports that it would actually work. There really isn't any. The trajectory of the virus probably was unaltered by any of the things you were told to do. In fact, the whole idea of 6-foot distancing or 3-foot distancing, they've now said probably none of that makes any sense, and it can probably spread 50 feet. And so there probably were times in a very enclosed setting when people hadn't been vaccinated and it was all throughout your community that being inside with other people probably wasn't a good idea. But the thing is it kind of depends on who you are. There are different risk factors based on different people. If you're 25 years old, the death rate is higher for being struck by lightning. You're more likely to be struck by lightning under 25 than to die from COVID. But if you're over 70 or over 70 and overweight, your risks go up dramatically. And there is a real risk. I don't think we should say there's no risk. There is a real risk for certain people. And so I'm not opposed to the vaccine. I think people ought to take it if you're in a risk category. If you're younger or if you think you've had it, I think it's a reasonable thing to be tested to see if you have antibodies to it already. I had it last spring, and so far there's no evidence of the immunity waning. And people say, well, you don't know. You don't know how long your immunity is going to last. And I was like, well, you don't know how long the vaccine is going to last. I mean, none of us know how long this will last, but common sense usually tells you that when you've had a previous infection with something, you have some immunity. And I didn't get any symptoms the last time. I think I probably won't get many the next time since I already have some immunity to the disease. But that's my decision. I'm not going to tell you what to do. In a free society, everybody judges their own risk. You're going to decide whether to get in a car, which is extremely dangerous, much more dangerous than anything you'll do in your life is a car. But we don't submit to the government that the government's going to put a governor on our car that we can't go more than 25 miles an hour. We'd save a lot of lives, but we just sort of accept the risk. I heard someone giving a speech the other day and they were talking about, an invention. And if there was this invention, but we knew it would aid in commerce and it would speed up a lot of things in our life and our life would be materially better, but 40,000 people would die a year if we allow this invention to come forward. Would you do it? And most people are like, no, that sounds terrible, all these deaths. Well, that's the car. I mean, the car has all these pluses, but it still has lots of deaths that we get from cars each year. So we've sort of lost our head in the sense that really we should think about risk, make these decisions individually, and it's sort of to each his own. While I'm a big advocate of taking the vaccine, my parents won't take it. They're in their 80s, but they won't take it. And that's, and if you've met my dad or read about dad, he is going to make his own decisions and he's not going to listen to his kids. But several of us are doctors and work with COVID patients and have taken it. After I had COVID, I went to the hospital and volunteered in the hospital for a few weeks. But the one thing I will tell you is the rules in the hospital, for safety's sake, is if you go in a COVID patient's room, you wear an N95 mask. You don't cut up your T-shirt and put your T-shirt on your face. It doesn't work. I mean, they've done studies on this. So when Fauci first came out, he said, none of the masks work. And he knew that that was a lie. It's what Plato called a noble lie. He thinks we're too stupid to understand the truth, but he didn't want you to buy the N95 mask because he thought they needed to be in the hospital first and we'd run out. And it's not a reasonable thing, but we should just be honest with people and say, look, we're going to ask the suppliers to send the N95 masks to the hospital first. They are the best masks and they work. Instead, he said when he finally came out, it said none of them worked. Then 3 weeks later, he came out and said they all work. It's equally not true, because if you blow particles through a cloth mask the same size as a virus, 97% of the particles go right through the cloth mask. So the cloth masks really don't work. The surgical masks are a little bit better, and then the N95 masks work. One of the things that Dr. Fauci could spend some time telling us, but he's not telling us, I'm going to tell you today because it's the most important thing. We're still going to get COVID. It's not as active out there. It's a lot less active, but you still may have somebody who's a family member or friend who gets it in town, and this is what you need to know, and it can save your life. If you get it, you've got a bronchitis, and you begin coughing, there is a treatment, and it reduces your death rate like 80%. It's called monoclonal antibodies. Donald Trump got them. Chris Christie got them. Giuliani got them. I have a family member who had metastatic cancer. She got them and survived. So the thing is people can survive, and these really work, but there's a window of time. If you wait too long, I had a friend who's about 41, overweight. He got it, almost died, but he waited too long. But nobody was telling him he needed to get to the hospital sooner. You can't wait, and like most men, I don't want to make a sexist argument, but men resist going to the doctor. They just stay home. But if you get COVID and you're coughing, you need to get in to see the doctor, because there is a treatment, and it reduces your death rate 80%. Instead, you've got people like Sanjay Gupta and Dr. Fauci on TV saying, oh, the mask is the most important thing. It's more important than the vaccine. Well, no, it's not. The mask really probably doesn't work much at all. Almost everybody that's gotten the infection in the last 2 months, as the numbers went like this, said they were wearing their mask all the time. So frankly, you can get it with your mask. The vaccine probably does work 90-some-odd% of the time, 95% of the time. So really the answer to stopping this is either natural immunity, which a lot of people have gotten, plus the vaccine. Now, they completely discount it. The reason why Fauci is still so upset and why Bashir is acting like a crazy person is that they don't count natural immunity, the people who've had it. So 32 million people, there's a website, you can see how many people have had COVID. 32 million people have had it. But the CDC, which is very conservative and not tending to exaggerate, estimates that 2 people for every 1 person is listed have gotten it. Why? Because a lot of young people got it and they didn't know it. So if you got it and one of you had the flu and you had COVID last year and you have 2 kids, chances are your kids may have had it and you just didn't know it if you didn't test them. So there's at least 2 for every 1, which means we have 100 million people in our country who have had it. That's a third of the country had it, but we also have over a third that's vaccinated. Now there's some overlap, but really we are close to the 2/3 that we kind of need, 2/3 plus some. And so I think we're very close to being over it. And I can see by the crowd here, you guys kind of think we're beyond this, and I think we may be. But we've got to really get to the point where we can get back to normal. Probably, and Adrian can reinforce this, probably the worst thing that's happened is at the state level with the powers that the governor has assumed. So we have a couple of problems in Kentucky. The governor assumed these powers in March. They went out of session, and so for 9 months, our legislature is completely powerless. To me, this is sort of reminiscent of when the king would dissolve Parliament. When he got mad at Parliament, he would just kick them out, and they couldn't come back, and he wouldn't let them come back in session. I think that's a defect in our state. I think we need to allow power for the state, for the legislature to come back in session. Now, if you want to limit what they come back in for, that'd be fine. You could say they only come back in maybe to discuss or debate edicts, that the governor puts forward. But we have to allow them to have the power to come back in. Otherwise, for 9 months, he is essentially a dictator. So when they came back in legislative session in January, there's emergency rules that were given to the governor back in the 90s. When the bill was passed, I think people assumed it would be like a tornado hits Lawrenceburg and the National Guard brings you blankets and food and water. Most of us would accept that as an emergency. But if you want to close a restaurant down for a year and say you can only have 25% occupancy, that's a policy. That's like legislation. That's not an emergency. That's not a 3-day thing where we're helping people with water and food. This is a major economic policy. And to say that only one person can do that with his sole authority, with no checks and balances from the legislature, is awful. I think this is the biggest constitutional issue, bigger than, I know there's a lot of important stuff in Washington. The issue we have with the governor and unlimited power is the biggest issue of our time. It's going to be decided by the Supreme Court. So the state legislature passed a law restricting his powers, and he immediately went to court, sued them, got a liberal judge in Frankfurt. Surprise, surprise. I don't know how you found a liberal judge in Frankfurt. I guess the opposite would really be true. Could you find a conservative judge in Frankfurt? But anyway, the judge put an injunction, and now it's going to go to the Supreme Court in June. But the governor is arguing that he has inherent power. I'd say he's been anointed by God. He's like a king of old. He's been told, and this is what he argues, that he can do whatever he wants no matter what the state legislature says. This goes against everything we know and care about as far as separation of powers and checks and balances. This is a big deal. But what really worries me is that I think the Supreme Court could rule in his favor. I don't know how they could possibly justify ruling against the state legislature amending their own laws to limit his power. But if we say the governor has inherent powers that cannot be checked by the legislature, that is a recipe for tyranny. I think we're already living in a form of that tyranny now. But can you imagine if that's upheld by the courts? If it is, there are two possibilities. The Supreme Court is elected, and you need to find out who your Supreme Court justice is from this area, and you need to watch closely how they vote. Now, I don't think you can really lobby them. You can't really call them. It's not appropriate to call them. But you can write a letter to the editor of your paper, and if you believe, as I do, that the governor should not have unlimited power and the state legislative law limiting his power should be upheld, I would write that. And if a bunch of you were writing to the paper and getting your letters in, maybe the Supreme Court justice will see some of those letters. I don't think you can do it directly. If we lose the vote, though, by all means, we need to become active and say we need people in the Supreme Court that actually will rule in favor of the Constitution. The other thing we can do, and I've advocated this from the beginning, is it probably should become a constitutional amendment. So if we're going to have trouble with a liberal Supreme Court in a conservative state, maybe we need a constitutional amendment that limits the governor's powers, emergency powers. And what they did basically is they said within 30 days there had to be a vote of the legislature to approve. If it wasn't approved in 30 days, it expired. So all of his edicts would expire. Right now he's saying we can't do anything until 2.5 million people are inoculated. Well, he just sort of pulled that out of his hat because there's no science saying that. You'd think if you were going to actually talk about science, it would be based on a death rate or a daily incidence rate or something, but he's just said 2.5 million. And so then you can be free again, or sort of free if he allows, depending on how much freedom he's going to allow you to have. But this is the issue of our time, and it's very important that we get involved. So watch closely that vote coming up in June. Adrian, do you have anything to add about the debate y'all had? Not what?
He should not be suspending statutes. We didn't clean that up the way it should be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The governor needs to be reined in, and the shorter the better. I personally had suggested when we talked about the constitutional amendment that it be only a few days as opposed to 30 days. I would limit them to, because really most emergencies would be taken care of within a week, 3 to 5 days. If we had a tornado or something where you're going to help people with food and water, within 3 to 5 days, things would normalize. And it has to be longer than that. I think it ought to be legislation. But that debate will happen. And I think either way, I think we need to get it into our Constitution, limiting the governor's powers. As far as Washington, it's crazy times up there too, between Nancy Pelosi and AOC on one side. Now we got Chuck Schumer in charge on the other side. In the past, when one party won, typically the country didn't lurch too quickly to the other side because we had the filibuster. And we still do have the filibuster, but if we lose it, they're already promising to do a lot of things. If Manchin votes with them and Sinema votes with them to get rid of the filibuster, what they do is there's a ruling by the chair that says you didn't get 60 votes, so you don't win. They vote to overturn the chair, and they can do that with 51 votes. It's sort of a weird set of rules that we've allowed 51 people to get rid of a 60-vote margin. So, and it's been done in the past. They did it on the Supreme Court for nominees, and I had mixed feelings with that, but I ended up siding with letting the majority pick the Supreme Court. But I think for law, it's a bad idea to get rid of the filibuster. If we do, the Democrats have promised to give us D.C. as a state. They have promised to pack the court, which will end up being ridiculous. If they add 4 Democrats immediately to the court and then they have a majority, what do you think Republicans will do when they get back in? Add 4, and before you know it, there's going to be like 99 Supreme Court justices. It'll be insane. But they want D.C. as a state. They want to pack the court. And then probably most damaging to the process, is take elections away from the states and localities and do them in Washington. So they would federalize all the elections. Everybody would be automatically registered. Everybody would automatically be sent a ballot. You might send them more than one ballot. You might have people that are designated to go to everybody's house to pick up their ballot. It's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for fraud. The problem with mail-in ballots is if you're not showing your identification and you're just going by signature, none of us here are signature experts. Can we really, and do you have the time to go through every ballot and look at every signature? It just won't happen. So I think the old-fashioned way was pretty good. You showed up, there was a Republican and a Democrat at the desk. You showed your ID, your name was in a book, you signed it, you voted, and the Republican and the Democrat saw 1,500 people voted in the precinct. They should have 1,500 pieces of paper at the end. If we have to go back, there's a ballot, a hand ballot or a paper ballot to correlate with the vote. And I think we can, particularly when it's decentralized that way, we can keep track of whether or not the election has integrity. So I think that this is an important aspect that we get away from the mail-in ballots and back to a traditional voting again. So I've advocated for election integrity reform, not only here, but in Georgia, Iowa, Arizona, throughout the United States. I think if we have fair elections, we have a chance of winning in Georgia the next time. What happened in Georgia is Stacey Abrams and the Republican Secretary of State decided they would mail applications to people and they would allow you to bring in thousands of ballots. The problem with one person going door to door and collecting them is, one, you have the verification problem of did they actually vote? Did you coerce their vote? And when you show up with 10,000 votes and you drop them in, I think it's much harder to verify than people one vote at a time. And so I think what we need to do and what I've advocated for is it needs to be individualized. If you want to vote by absentee, fine. You or your guardian or a family member has to apply, but you can only get one application. In Georgia and other places, what they did is the application was not specific, so they just mailed applications to everybody. And then if you didn't respond, they mailed you again and again and again, so it became a solicitation, and I think that's a mistake. Taxes are going to go up. They're talking about an infrastructure bill, but they're going to raise the corporate income tax. Realize that when they raise the corporate income tax, that means companies that can leave will leave. A good example of in Kentucky about lowering the corporate income tax and having more money here was General Motors added 400 jobs in Bowling Green on the assembly line there because they saved hundreds of millions of dollars when their tax went from 35 to 21. People say, oh, well, some of their investors got rich. Well, who are their investors? Everybody works in the union, has stock in GM. If you own a mutual fund, you may have stock in GM. We're all small owners of these companies. Everybody sort of owns them. But it also helps the workers in that we added jobs. Even if it helps the stockholders, it also helps the workers. Probably worse than raising the corporate income tax, though, is they're talking about raising capital gains tax. So we're talking about going from 20% to 43%. They're also talking about getting rid of the step-up basis for land. So if you own 40 acres here and you're going to give it to your kids and you bought it for $100,000 and now it's worth $1 million, used to be when you died it stepped up to $1 million, and then your family would only pay capital gains if it appreciated from $1 million up, but not from the $100,000 that it appreciated in your parents' lifetime. That would be devastating to a lot of farm families not to have that. So there's a lot of bad things that are going on, but basically it's the fundamental difference between the parties. They want you to give more of your money or take more of your money. We want you to keep more of your money. We believe, as Thomas Paine wrote, that government is a necessary evil, meaning that we want as small amount of government as we can possibly live with because we want you to be left with most of your liberty and most of your income. This will be a colossal battle over the next 2 years. If we keep the filibuster, I think we can keep most of the country safe from these people. If they get rid of the filibuster, they could damage the country, I think, in an irreparable way. You know, if we get federalization of elections and D.C. becomes a state and they pack the court, those are things that are hard to reverse. So let's hope we can hang on till 2022. I'm up in 2022. The House is up again, all the House in 2022. Because of the census, people are moving from high tax states to lower tax states. So New York's going to lose a seat. California's going to lose a seat for the first time ever. Pennsylvania's going to lose a seat. Florida picks up 2. Texas picks up 2. their legislatures are completely controlled by Republicans, so they're going to redistrict it and make it harder for some of the Democrats to win again. So it looks like we can probably, just through migration south, pick up the House in 2 years. If we hang on to what we have, we should be able to pick up pretty easily 8 to 10 seats. So I think there's a better than 50% chance that we win the House. The Senate's 50-50, I think. We have to win in Georgia, Arizona. We also have to maintain a seat in Pennsylvania, which is hard. So it could go either way. Reforming the election laws will help us to win, I think, but there's no guarantee. We've essentially become a two-party state that is city versus the rural. Almost all the rural people are becoming Republicans. Anderson County, I'd consider to be a rural county. You've gone, thanks to Dave and others, from a Democrat county to a Republican county. But again, I think it's mostly just that the Democrat Party's become so crazy. I was telling somebody earlier, I'll bet you cannot meet someone in town who agrees with Dr. Levine, Republican or Democrat. And I think if you were a Democrat and you heard who this Dr. Levine was, you'd say, there's no way I can be a Democrat. She's someone who has surgically altered her body to appear. Children can make these decisions with or against their parents' will. So they're saying that a child can consent to hormones that change your appearance. They don't change your sex. You cannot change your sex, but they change the appearance of your sex. So they would give a 12, 13, 14-year-old girl so much testosterone that she grows a beard. If you stop that, she never goes back to looking the way she once did. She'll somewhere be in between, but she's forever changed, at least superficially. No child should get to make that decision, but that's why people are changing. These people are so crazy, so outside the mainstream that you won't find anybody in your community who believes that. I defy you to see if you can find a Democrat in your area that believes that. But that's where the National Party has gone. Then you have AOC promoting socialism. She is a socialist. So I think that has scared a lot of people in the countryside. Unfortunately, in the cities have become more and more Democrat. We're fortunate in Kentucky that our rural vote outweighs our city vote. And I think we'll be fine as long as it does. The one urban area that is good for us is actually up near Cincinnati, which is mostly Republican. Louisville and Lexington are a struggle. They've been harder. In 2010, I lost Fayette County by 1,000 votes. So I must have gotten like 49%. I think in 2016, I probably lost it by 35,000 votes. I think McConnell lost it by 35 or 40,000 votes. So we're getting worse and worse in Fayette, but we're getting better and better in Anderson and surrounding counties. So we do have our work cut out for us. As we move forward, I think one of the most important things that we need to express to people is that America is not a bad place. We're not a bad country. We're not bad people. We're not a people that hate people based on the color of their skin. And when the Democrats try to say that that's who America is or that's who Republicans are, we need to look them in the eye, point at their chest and say, Democrats need to apologize for Jim Crow. The party of Jim Crow were the Democrats. When Kentucky had Jim Crow laws, they were passed all by Democrats. We had a few Republicans, but not one of the Republicans voted for Jim Crow. When John Lewis is marching across the bridge in Selma, he's being beaten up by Democrats. He's been beaten and bloodied by Democrats. Every one of them. They need to apologize for the history of their party. Our party, William Worley was a black Republican in Louisville in 1900. He started and founded the Kentucky NAACP, and he fought the Jim Crow laws that said a white man couldn't sell a house to a black man or vice versa. He was a Republican. He fought this all the way to the Supreme Court, and we won unanimously in 1917. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of segregation, but that was Republicans fighting to end Democrat segregation, Jim Crow laws. So I say push back on these people. I'm sick and tired of it. I don't want to hear it from the Courier-Journal. I don't want to hear it from any of these people calling us names. The history of our party is a good history, and we ought to be proud of our party. They need to apologize for their history. But it's bigger than that. They're saying the whole country is terrible. They're saying we haven't gotten any better, that all the stain of slavery has gotten worse. I think it's so much better than it's ever been as far as race relations. I say when I see my kids' interactions with people, they don't see race at all. And so I think it's so much better as far as schools, no schools discriminate, public businesses don't discriminate. I think we've come a long way. So, but they're trying to divide us and make everything about race. 4 years ago, nobody was talking about race. Now everybody's talking about everything's about race. It's like, did we all of a sudden become bad people again? Did we jump back 40 years and become somehow this racist nation? None of it's true. It's all coming from the media. So I think we should be proud of our country, recognizing that it wasn't perfect and that we've gotten better. But we can't let them change the narrative that somehow America is this terrible place to live. I'm proud to live here. I'm proud to represent Kentucky, and I thank you for your support. Thank you.